Dum 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 Kalamazoo. You know that song Kalamazoo?
Mm-hmm.
This beer I'm drinking is from Kalamazoo Street in Michigan. I always thought Kalamazoo was a city, but it might just be a street in Marshall, Michigan. I've got a cold.
I gotta go. The city of Kalamazoo.
Oh, it's from Kalamazoo. Well, there's a street in Marshall, Michigan called Kalamazoo also. I just heard that from Tessa, our bartender,
Oh.
here at Gebhard's
Oh, well, it's a
Beer
city
Culture
too.
Bar on West 72nd Street,
Kalamazoo is a city in the southwest region of the U.S. state of Michigan.
Michigan.
It is the county seat of Kalamazoo County.
Right. Michigan. We've never been to Michigan.
I gotta get. We did that song once. We sang the song to this beer already. I got a gal from Kalamazoo.
I mean, I've had this beer before?
Yep. Yep, and we sang about it.
Wow. You know what? Oh, maybe. I'm looking at my notes. Now I lost it. Yeah, what I'm drinking is Dark Horse Smells Like a Safety Meeting beer. IPA, double IPA.
What's a safety meeting?
I don't know. I asked Tessa.
She didn't know?
She said that's a weird name, and it is a weird name.
Smells like a safety meeting.
Smells like a safety meeting.
I don't know. Are you recording?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're doing our opening now.
Yeah. Okay.
And I can pick some from it. So we're both coming down with a cold.
Well, you're coming out of it, hopefully. You're coming out of it.
Well, it's coming out of me.
Ew.
That's
Stop.
coming straight out of my chest.
Stop. That's how come I'm getting sick.
Yeah. You know, if I start coughing and run out of the room,
You're making me sick.
it's because I have to go out to the street to do some
Never
expectorating.
never mind.
That's why I left the door open here.
I got a gal in Kalamazoo, something like that. But you played the music too.
Well, we can do that, but then we have to go to the bop bop. Bop bop.
Okay,
Yeah.
whatever you like.
So we're both coming down with colds, and I don't know what else to talk about.
Well-
I'm really excited about this ball I found.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's like
You found it at
I
the
found it at Essex Lawn Bowling Green out in
in
Bloomfield.
the gym or in the locker room
It
or
was
in the
it was sitting out
outside?
on the grass.
So some poor child left it there.
Some poor child left it there,
and
and
you
I
took
took it.
Wow.
Well, I don't know what child took. Was there a dollar out there?
Wow.
I know. I thought I saw a dollar blowing in the breeze. It was a leaf. It was a green leaf.
It's a green leaf. You know, that's horrible.
I don't
They're
know who
gonna
the child
come-
was. I'm getting to play with it, and I'm going to play with my
They're
grandson.
going to come back and look for
Where's
their ball.
my ball?
Exactly.
Where's my ball? I got it, kid. You can't have it back. I'm loving this ball. It's so bouncy.
Yeah, that's what the kid thought too.
I was hitting it
He
up
loved
against
his
the
bouncy
wall,
ball.
and I didn't want to go bowling. I was having such a great time.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all very interesting, honey.
Is it? Is it? Is it? Is
It
it?
was.
Is it?
I think so. But I'm Rebecca McCain, and he is Alan Winson, and you're tuned into... Oh, God. I'm going to do this again.
All right.
Okay. Are you done?
No. Go.
I'm Rebecca McCain. He is Alan Winson, and you are tuned in to barcrawlradio at Gebhard's Beer Culture Bar, episode number 46 coming up. And here we go.
This is what Dorothy wrote in September of 1945 after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mr. Truman was jubilant. President Truman, true man. What a strange name, come to think of it. We refer to Jesus Christ as true God and true man. Truman is a true man of his time in that he was jubilant. He was not a son of God, brother of Christ, brother of the Japanese, jubilating as he did. He went from table to table on the cruiser which was bringing him home from the Big Three conference, telling the great news. Jubilant, the newspapers said. Jubilate Deo, we have killed 318,000 Japanese. That is, we hope we have killed them, the Associated Press on page 1, column 1 of the Herald Tribune says. The effect is hoped for, not known. It is to be hoped that they are vaporized, our Japanese brothers, scattered, men, women, and babies, to the four winds, over the seven seas. Perhaps we will breathe their dust into our nostrils, feel them in the fog of New York on our faces, feel them in the rain on the hills of Easton. Jubilate Deo, President Truman was jubilant. We have created destruction. We have created a new element called Pluto. Nature had nothing to do with it.
With us today on barcrawlradio are Martha Hennessy and Carmen Trotta, members of the Catholic Worker Movement founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin in 1933 in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The Catholic Worker has grown to over 200 autonomous communities around the nation. In fact, we have some Catholic workers from Michigan here with us today on the Gebhard's Porch, and they are committed to voluntary poverty, prayer, and hospitality for the homeless, exiled, hungry, and forsaken.
One more item. Martha and Carmen are under house arrest for trespassing onto the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in St. Mary's, Georgia on April 4th, 2018. Their team of 7 entered the Strategic Weapons Facility, Atlantic Administration Building, where the Trident nuclear missiles are stored. Their charges carried a maximum penalty of over 20 years in a federal prison. We will learn more about what they did and why they did it later in this BCR program. For now, welcome Carmen and Martha to our podcast.
Thank you.
And what are you drinking?
Yeah, we asked you to find out what you're drinking there.
Well, since I'm from Vermont and our state bird is the hermit thrush, I chose this drink, the hermit thrush something or other.
All right.
There you go.
Is it
Sour
good?
and pale.
Did you actually do that on purpose?
Oh, okay.
Fascinating.
She nodded yes.
I was all excited when I heard a minute ago from Vermont. I was like, whoa, Martha's from Vermont too. What a coincidence.
Yeah, obviously not a coincidence at all.
And
And Carmen, and you're drinking?
I got a KCBC Blocktopus.
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 You know, those guys must have fun naming these beers. That's what I got to
Yeah.
say. They're like in the back room going, what are we going to name this one?
From
I
the Kings
gave-
County Brewing Company.
Yeah, I gave mine earlier. Dark Horse smells like safety meeting.
Which I
I have no idea what that means.
I don't think it smells good.
But-
I have a feeling it doesn't smell good.
No, you would hate this. You would hate this.
Yeah.
It comes from Marshall, Michigan, and our Catholic worker guests here are from Michigan.
Yes.
Right, right.
So it's all very apropos.
Do you like it?
I do. I like kind of almost vile beers. I like beers that kind of like attack you, especially when I've got this cold now, and it's like cutting through all the.
He likes pain.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
could change there. This is
No, I don't
similar.
want you. I don't want to give you my germs. You don't need
And
that.
I'm drinking water
Yeah.
this time.
So let's go. We have to stop all the fun here. We opened this Barcrawl Radio episode with Martha reading Dorothy Day's response to the U.S. attack on Hiroshima, Japan, at the end of World War II. The complete statement will be heard at the end of this episode. I think I can safely say that most of our listeners do not know Dorothy Day. I mean, at one time she was known, but I don't know that many people know who she is, what she did, or the Catholic Worker Movement. Certainly the people here on the porch know.
Well, the people who listen to our former Barcall Radio.
Witness Against Torture know.
No. Brian and
Brian-
Kathy. Aren't
Brian
they Catholic
Terrell.
workers? Brian
Sure.
Terrell, yeah.
I mean, obviously,
They're
all
Catholic workers.
that your community knows about it.
And ours too now.
And we do too, and we want others to know. We want others to know
Yes.
what you all are doing. I understand it's built on core Catholic beliefs, but I'm a partially practicing Jew. Becky is an atheist. Can we talk about the Catholic Worker and Dorothy Day in ways that Becky and I and our listeners who may not have heard of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker, so that we can understand it, understand what's going on? That's kind of our goal, right?
Okay. Did you have a question following that?
Well, is Dorothy Day available to those who are not Catholic, who are who are not believers of God even?
Well, it's a very interesting person. Dorothy is a socialist as a young woman, a suffragette. She's an anti-imperialist. She's part of the Anti-Imperialist League. Early on, as a young woman writer, she was opposed to U.S. entrance into World War I. She supported Sandino from trying to kick the United States out of Nicaragua so many years ago in 1927. So Dorothy came from the left. politically.
Right. She had loved Bernie Sanders.
She was, I think, considerably further to the left than Bernie.
Then Bernie. Okay.
So, I mean, that's a place to sort of begin with her. There is then a very deep conversion to Catholicism, and I think that is in part due to the regard that she had, herself living something of a bohemian life, but the regard that she had for the working class. And she was a IWW person also.
Right.
And
That's the
she had
International
Workers of the World.
Workers of the World, right?
Right. And so she talks about, she talks about some of the working class women that she had met over the years and her sort of great admiration for her. And it could be that her choice, she had been a fervent Episcopalian child as a little girl, but her choice of Catholicism, I think, was influenced by wanting to be one with the working class. I
Okay.
think. Now, Martha, it's Martha's granny, so she can tell you much more.
Right.
No,
and we're gonna find out more about you. We're gonna like circle back to Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker.
Yeah, but before we get into any deeper into Dorothy Day and what she helped create, let's find out a bit about what you do at the Catholic Worker Community Houses in downtown Manhattan. Carmen, you reside at St. Joseph's House and Martha at Mary House, both in the Bowery. What are these places? What happens?
Well, they're called Houses of Hospitality, and Peter Maurin had a vision of caring for the poor. We consider Matthew 25 our manifesto, the Sermon on the Mount, to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give drink to the thirsty. And for myself, I am a wife and a mother and a grandmother, and I have been volunteering at Mary House. I don't live there
You
full
don't
time.
live there. Mm-hmm.
I'm
How much time do you spend there?
probably a little less than half of my time.
Half a week.
Yeah, I try to break it up.
A week here, a week
bigger
there.
stints of time.
Right. And
Right.
Carmen, how long are you at St. Joseph's?
A little over 30 years.
Yeah, but you don't spend the whole week there. It's like the half a week and then.
I used to spend the whole week there. My father is 91 years old, and so I've been giving some attention to my father by going home and cooking 3 days a week and just tending to him in certain
Right,
ways.
right.
And at this point, preparing for trial.
Right, and we're
yes.
going to get to that. And we're going to get to Peter Maurin, too. We want to learn more about him because he's a very important figure in this whole Catholic Worker movement.
I
Yes.
was curious. So I know that a lot of the shelters in town, and I don't know if this is anything like that, they have restrictions in terms of how long you can stay at the shelter, just one night or 2 nights. Do you have, are those city ordinances, or what is yours like?
We're not an agency. We try to be more of a home, an extension of an actual home. People come to us and people die with us.
So they can stay as long as they need to.
Yeah, I think mostly a majority of the people who come to live at the Catholic Worker end up spending the rest of their lives at the Catholic Worker.
Wow.
So 2/3 of the community are people who came from the streets or from dire circumstances.
Right. But then do you feed more even than the people that live in the house? Do you have?
Yes.
Yes.
The soup line is quite a bit larger than the people who live at the house.
Is it literally a soup line, or is it
It is literally a soup line.
right?
Someone recently said that this is the only place that calls itself a soup kitchen that is actually a soup kitchen.
A soup
soup
kitchen.
We have soup kitchen everywhere.
And what is the favorite soup?
Actually, at St. Joe's right now, we have this for the last 6 years. My roommate, Jeffrey, is the one who does the soup at the house, and he's a genius. He goes down and makes his own thing week after week. Lots of greens. It's always vegetarian. If it's not vegetarian, we inform the people there that some of it has meat in it.
And I guess no milk or dairy or something or that in it.
No, there's
There is
milk.
that.
Yeah,
There might
there's
be.
milk and coffee.
Oh, and the
I
soup?
must tell you, so the people that we're serving, I mean, it's a horrifying thing, really, and I don't know that any of us can get to the place where the people on the street are. To think that you could live in Manhattan and that the world so does not care for you that it would allow you to sleep outside. It's very early. In the 19th century, the church promulgated the notion that housing is a right. And these people are clearly, it is clear that they've had a right ripped away from them. The level of substance abuse on the streets in New York City these days is phenomenal. 60,000 people are in the shelters in New York City. Our guests who come from Europe are astounded. People who come from Germany and see people begging on the streets,
In this advanced country. I put quotes around
Yes,
advanced.
yes, this advanced country, this
Yeah.
advanced democracy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
this advanced capitalist state, actually.
How many do you serve a day?
Well, that's interesting too, because given the sort of ethnic cleansing of Manhattan that's been going on for the last
40 years.
when I came to the Catholic Worker, we would get over 300 people to come to the soup line. The soup line only lasted for an hour and a half. Our kitchen only holds 25 people at a time. So we were moving people through. And that has really begun to diminish sort of enormously, particularly this year. No year prior have we ever seen such a large drop in the number of people coming to the house. And the amount of
That sounds like it's good. It's like people.
Well, yeah.
don't-
What would you?
That's not good.
How do you
they're
account for that?
priced and policed out of Manhattan.
Out of
They're
Manhattan.
being
Yeah.
disappeared. It's not that homelessness is decreasing.
So they're out in the boroughs, you think?
That would assume,
Or-
yeah.
yeah.
And the shelters.
You know. And there are people that stay with you too. And I heard that there were more people that stayed in the past that stay now. That actually sleep overnight.
Is your house full?
Mary
guests?
House is, St. Joe's is full. Mary House is less so. It has more space. We have about 20 people there now. But we just take in who we can manage. I mean, small scale is important with this.
It used to be the case that people could come out of college and do a couple of years at the Catholic Worker.
To volunteer.
But now
Right.
they are so overloaded with debt that we see none of them.
Wow.
Kids getting out of college these days need to get a job right away. And once you get a job, you stay hang on for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You've habituated to a different life, and you've grabbed
Exactly.
onto something. You have a routine, and it's working for you. Maybe just keeping you. I mean, for most Americans, it's just barely keeping your head
Right.
above water.
Right.
And so we have lost that. And we're not a 501c3. We're not a nonprofit, so it's not like we can have their loans deferred.
Donations run the place.
What's that?
Donations run the place.
Donations run the place. So how is it you're not a nonprofit?
No, it's a 501c3 is a particular form of. If we were a nonprofit, we would have to do an extraordinary amount of paperwork,
Ah.
and we have.
And you're really busy taking care of the guests.
Yeah.
Yes, I understand.
Tremendous amount of work.
Right. Right.
Right. The other thing you do at the at your Catholic worker houses is produce a newspaper, the Catholic Worker, which is a very unusual kind of. Oh, Antony just showed up. Hi, Anthony. How you doing? From Witness Against Torture, and I just.
You're talking about the newspaper.
The newspaper, and it was created by Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, who we want to talk about originally for a penny a copy. How much does it cost now?
Same.
Penny a copy.
or 25 cents a year, right?
I've heard that was really, and people get it for free. I've heard that to give it a price actually allowed it to go on newsstands,
Ah.
and that was the reason it was a
That
penny
was
a
the
So
copy.
reason.
essentially, it's free.
I would say.
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah.
And
say
however,
so.
whenever it has always been the case that whenever the New York Catholic Worker does get into dire financial straits, we put a front page ad out and ask people to donate to us, and that has always worked to keep us floating above water. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So what kinds of? You're one of the editors of the Catholic Worker,
As
aren't
Martha,
you,
too.
Carmen?
Both of us are.
Martha and Martha too. And I saw there was a Catholic Worker I picked up in Washington when I was there with Witness Against Torture, protest against Guantanamo, which Antony was there also. And and I noticed there was something that you wrote about poverty, I think, in that one. So you both write for the Catholic Worker also.
Yeah.
We try to.
Should be just by the way, only because you mentioned it, 4 of the 7 people who went onto the base in Kings Bay, Georgia, had previously in 2005 gone down to Cuba while there was a hunger strike at Guantanamo,
Right.
to try and call attention to the fact that the United States was torturing prisoners.
Right.
And the torture practice, the war crimes simply go on and on. At this point in Yemen, there are 18 black site prisons. The Associated Press has covered it. There are American interrogators on the spot. They don't do the torture, though. They let the mercenaries do the torture, and we just interview them afterwards.
Just like
and they think this absolves them.
Right.
of the
Just like
crime.
we're not in a war against Yemen, though it's our bombs that are dropped on the bus.
You know, I
bus full of
knew
children.
this was going to happen
Stunning.
because you all are in so much stuff that you're trying to. It's like herding cats.
We're anarchists.
You're anarchists. That you're taking over the radio program here. And go ahead.
Okay, so the Catholic Worker Movement began with Dorothy Day when Dorothy Day met Peter Maurin, and we'll talk about that meeting in a minute. But first, I wanted to ask you, Martha. Dorothy Day was your grandmother. What was she like as a grandmother?
Oh, she was a hell of a granny. She was very gentle, very quiet, very strong, very focused. I mean, my mother was permissive. My mother was all over the place. When Granny came to take care of us, we washed the dishes, unlike when our mother was in charge. And, you know, as a teenager, I fully understood that she was very revered and that she was someone that we shared with the world. And from a very young age, I was, you know, saturated with this culture of understanding the suffering of others and caring about the suffering of others. And so she was very much a constant. I mean, I grew up fatherless, so it was my mother and my grandmother who really were the big figures in
Your
our
mother,
lives.
Tamara.
Tamar.
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 Tamar. We have you now. Tell us one other little anecdote about your grandmother, something that you remember that can tell us about who she was as a
grandmother.
As a grandmother.
Well, she had to watch 9 grandkids sort of run wild in Vermont. That was hard on her. And she was a pacifist, and my brothers, having grown up in Vermont, were hunters, and they had guns. And when she came to stay with us, we would put her in the room with the guns, and I feel really badly about that to this day. But she was very gentle. I mean, she was very adamant in where she stood. It was very clear. But she allowed us. I mean, she had a young wildlife, and so she was very receptive to, you know, not clamping down on others. And I would just say that she taught us patience. Once I was sweeping the floor. I was 16 years old at St. Joe's on the 3rd floor where she lived. And I was like really rushing, trying to get the job done. And she said, "Martha, slow down. This is how you take the broom strokes." So I feel like she gave us, you know, lessons that really...
And she showed you how to sweep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Slow down.
Slow down,
or just
take
to slow
small
down.
strokes.
Yes.
And she called me Martha, and she called my sister Mary, Mary. She said, "Martha, you need to be more like Mary." And she was right.
So when you hear from the Commonweal magazine, Dorothy Day is one of the most interesting, significant, meaningful figures of the 20th century. That's pretty big.
Yeah, that was written for an obituary
Yeah.
when she died. Yes, we understood.
So you see her as a grandmother, but also as this great figure.
An ordinary person and an amazing figure.
Yeah, and she returned pacifism to the Catholic Church as an issue.
The U.S. Catholic
Something to be
Church.
considered.
So the Catholic Worker Movement is embraced by the dogma of the Catholic Church?
Not necessarily. I mean, the U.S. Catholic Church, I think it's important that I read this to you about, and this was written in the 1950s regarding the Catholic Worker Movement. The response of the Catholic clergy in America to the philosophy of the Catholic worker has been mixed. Many members of the lower clergy have been attracted by the Catholic worker philosophy and have been inspired by it, but the hierarchy on the whole has remained rather cool to it. This cool response may be a reflection of the desire of the hierarchy to make the Catholic Church acceptable to American bourgeois society. Association of the Church with radical doctrines would jeopardize acceptance. However, there has never been any indications from the hierarchy that the doctrines of the Catholic worker are incompatible with those of the Catholic Church. And it was Peter Maurin who brought the dynamite of the Church to Dorothy, the Catholic social teachings.
Who was Peter Maurin?
He was a French peasant that came from a family of 23 children. He emigrated to Canada in his youth. He was educated by the Christian Brothers. He did manual labor in North America. He was a philosopher. He was a teacher. And
he was a mega talker.
And he really did know how to talk. My mother said you couldn't get a word in edgewise with him.
And he left for the United States in part because he did not want to participate in the war. Peter Maurin was also a pacifist.
Yeah, he left France because he didn't want to participate.
So most people recognize that Jesus was a pacifist, or rather, many people recognize that Jesus was a pacifist. But by and large, that enormous segment of the population that considers itself Christian would not give pacifism the time of day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We saw the movie that was based on Dorothy Day's early life with Martin Sheen playing Peter Maurin. Did you ever meet? You never met him because
Peter Maurin, he died in 49. I was
Yeah.
born in 55.
Yeah,
My
right,
youngest
right.
sister, oldest sister knew of him.
right, right. Can we talk a little bit more about Dorothy Day's early life when she was a young girl? Robert Ellsberg was the grandson of Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon paper son of Daniel Ellsberg. Sorry about that. Who wrote the Pentagon paper from Pentagon paper fame? Early in life, Dorothy led a rootless bohemian life, according to Robert Ellsberg. She partied, spent time in bars, had love affairs. She hung out with Eugene O'Neill, took care of him when he was drunk. She was also a newspaper writer, a socialist, a unionist. Who was this young woman? She was a rebel rouser.
Yeah,
She was out there.
I don't believe that she had many lovers. I don't believe that part.
Yeah.
But she was a journalist, and she was witnessing in the teens and 20s the plight of the workers, families working and starving, not being able to feed their children. And she was writing about American history and the failures of capitalism.
And she was involved with the suffragette movement, too.
And she never voted,
She never voted.
not once.
Why?
My grandfather voted for
Wow.
Eugene Debs. She didn't. She's an anarchist, a radical Christian anarchist. And she went along with a friend down to D.C. for that. It wasn't that it was based on any strong principles at that point in her life. And she felt that any kind of participation in this government
Oh, I see.
practice.
Okay.
She did have. She also had a very brutal time in jail
Experience
in
with
in that instance. They were arrested out in front of the White House.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the women were treated very badly.
They went to a jail, Occoquan.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. I read about it. It was horrible what they did to these women.
Yes.
Who were just protesting and asking for the right to vote.
Yeah.
They treated them. I mean, I'm sorry I can't quote the actual article.
She
Maybe
was-
I'll
she
link
was
to it.
beaten.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And they were force fed raw eggs. I heard. I mean, it was just awful. Just awful what they did to them.
So she went through a period of conversion. What was that? What brought that on?
The birth of my mother. Well, she was raised Episcopalian. Her parents were nominally practicing. She was reading the Bible as a child. She was paying attention to her playmates, neighbors who were quite religious. I mean, it was something that resonated with her entire life, this presence of God.
Uh-huh.
And the Catholic Church, she, as Carmen had talked about, she affiliated with the masses, the universal church, the poor, the working poor. And she had my mother baptized within a year of her birth, and then she herself became baptized. And of course, it was a conversion of sorrow. There wasn't a lot of joy in it. She understood the history of the church being on the wrong side of history. And of course, it meant the end of her relationship with the father of her child. And so it brought a tremendous amount of grief and heartbreak.
Yeah.
But it sounds like she was the kind of woman that couldn't do something halfway.
Well, God had chosen her, and she did her best to listen to that voice.
There was a point in her young life when they were living in Chicago, and the circumstances of the family, they had a spasm of genuine poverty in the household. And as a young girl returning from school, she would walk with her friends, and she would walk by her own property, her own house, and she would enter into a more elegant hotel. And that's where she would leave her friends. And then when they would leave, she would go back, and she would go back to her house. So she had this spasm of poverty that seemed very interesting, that very early in her life, to go back to that, to recognize what it was to suddenly drop out of
Right.
of society.
Right.
And to be, just that she was so sensitive to
She could
the
empathize.
discrimination that might occur
Right.
for a poor person.
Can we talk about poverty as a key element to the Catholic worker and Dorothy Day and that experience and her ideas?
Voluntary poverty and the daily practice of the works of mercy. That was the easier way of, you had a longer
Yep.
statement about what the Catholic worker was,
Yeah.
but the shorter one is that one.
So, all right, say that again and explain it.
Voluntary poverty and the daily practice of the works of mercy. Knowing that the community gets paid, it's the full-time thing that they're doing if they're part of the core community. And, things are really quite good at the house these days. When I got to the house, we never got fresh milk. We now get fresh milk. When I got there, we were still using powdered milk. Oddly enough, what happened is that the powdered milk actually became more expensive. I don't know how that happened. And we used to travel to Chinatown once a week to pick up, it was refried rice that we would go to Chinatown and bring back to the house, and that became dinner. And at this point, there's a place in New Jersey called the Barn, and they have for the last 20 years, they have been supplying us with vegetables and food for free. The founder of that group had a daughter who was a nun herself in the order of Mother Teresa, and she found out sort of how poor they were. When he found that out, he actually began to bring them food, and then it became sort of a business. They have in that part of New Jersey, forgive me for not remembering the place, something. It's an enormous store. They clear the shelves. It serves a wealthy neighborhood, and they clear their vegetables more quickly than most
Right.
large stores.
Right.
And the workers are allowed to take whatever they want, and then they give the rest of it to the general public. And this organization goes there and takes most of it, and then they distribute it for free. And all the workers there are volunteers. The Barn in New Jersey. It's a
Barn
great
in
gift
New
to the
Jersey.
Catholic worker.
That's amazing.
I want to unpack this poverty idea a little. Martha, you want to say something?
Peter talked about voluntary poverty as something that you take on voluntarily, clearly, and it's not rejecting the basics of our needs. It's rejecting the luxuries. We forego the luxuries so that others can attain the basics. And
You too live that life of poverty.
I have a husband who works.
Yeah.
I think that I am actually
Middle
fairly
class.
middle class, white privilege.
Carmen, do you lead a life of poverty?
I just live in an enhanced environment for the daily practice of the works of mercy, really. I mean, I don't, and several of us in the Kings Bay Plowshares do not have bank accounts. I had a bank account when I got out of college. I paid off my student loans very quickly, and I have not had a bank account since. So.
I just want to read what Dorothy Day said about poverty. Well, one thing she said, I condemn poverty and I advocate it. Poverty is simple and complex at once. It is a social phenomenon and a personal matter. It is a paradox.
What we are not is we are not destitute. The people on the street are destitute. We are not destitute, and
Yeah.
we have a community. We have friends, and since 1933, no one has. There's been a group surrounding us, a cloud of witnesses surrounding us that have not allowed us to fail.
But you're certainly not rich. You don't have a lot of stuff.
It's also a means of not supporting the war-making economy. The more simply that you can live, and this ties in with the climate disruption as well, the more simply we live, the less we rely on the war machine that requires infinite consumption of resources for a high standard of living.
And it has to keep being ratcheted up and up and up and up. So Dorothy Day did not want to be considered a saint. Why is that?
That was just one quote from her.
Tell
We're
us
all
what's-
called to become saints.
Wow.
We're all
called to
That's
become
what she
saints.
says. We're all called to become saints.
That's what Dorothy Day says? Or that's
And what she thought
Martha
herself
says?
is that perhaps she wasn't worthy of it, and she didn't want to be called a saint. She said, in part because it sets her on a pedestal,
Right.
and no one else can do it. Only Dorothy can do it.
Right.
But that's not true, and she wanted to be face to face with you, saying that no, you can do it too.
She didn't want to be held back.
She
didn't
didn't want to
want
think
others
it was
to be held
special.
back.
That what she was doing was special. What she was doing should be normal. If we were giving ourselves to each other, then
Right.
then this would be normal. To have people in at your house for dinner would be normal. To have people on the streets begging for food would be wildly abnormal.
Right.
That's the best explanation I've heard of that, because I've been doing a lot of reading to get ready for our talk here, and that is the best thing. We're all saints, or potentially.
We should be.
We should be working towards that.
We can
towards it.
choose. Our free will can help us to choose what's better for the common good.
Yeah.
So I understand there's a discussion within the church that Dorothy Day should be considered for sainthood. Do you think that's going to happen?
Knowing the Catholic Church hierarchy today, is that going to happen?
We desperately need her as a saint in these times because of all the
What she stands
scandal
for.
that goes on with the church.
So the church needs her.
I mean, if there was
Well,
anyone,
the church needs her, but the Catholics need her as well.
I think I would admire her as a saint. I mean, I admire her anyway, but
Well, she is a saint. They just haven't done the expensive paperwork of it yet.
yeah.
And we're going to take a break here and be right back with Martha Hennessy and Carmen Trotta here on Barcrow Radio. They're workers in the Catholic Workers Movement.
If your brother is hungry, you feed him. You don't meet him at the door and say, "Go be thou filled," or wait for a few weeks and you'll get a welfare check. And you sit him down and feed him. And so that's how the soup kitchen started. As a matter of fact, we didn't start it at all. We were feeding a house full of people, but the soup line started because one of the men who had charge of the clothes room didn't have any more clothes to give out, so he began saying, "Just come in and have a cup of coffee." And so pretty soon a line formed at the door. Peter Maurin was always in favor of soup, being a good French peasant, so it became a soup line. And we still have the soup line, a couple of hundred people a day coming in.
You are listening to Bar Crawl Radio on the porch at Gebhard's Beer Culture Bar on West 72nd Street, across the street from the mortuary and down the block from Papaya Hot Dogs and Trader Joe's. Our conversation today is with two most interesting people who have literally dedicated their lives to the work of peace and helping the poor. These are not your usual New Yorkers. Are we okay with our drinks, by the way?
Yes,
You
I'm
okay?
a
I mean,
Vermonter.
Carmen,
okay.
you're going on your second.
I'm
You're-
thriving. Yes, yeah. I'm doing,
You're driving. Oh my
no,
goodness.
thriving,
Thriving.
You're thriving. Okay, don't drive because the subway's right up the street here. It's right up the street there. So you can
I don't think he has any
you can let
intention
this
to.
let New York.
When the
subway
time
drive
comes, you
home.
can point me in the right direction.
There, oh, I will. I will. All right. So let's learn a little bit more about you two in particular. Martha, you're a retired occupational therapist. You work now at the Catholic Worker Mary House in the Lower East Side. Forgive me if I make any mistakes here. You spend part of your time with your family in Vermont and part of the time here. We talked a little bit about that.
And Carmen, you're an associate editor for the Catholic Worker newspaper and on the executive board of the War Registers League.
The War Resisters League.
Oh.
Only for a couple of years. I was a couple.
The War Resisters
But not
League.
anymore.
I'm quite I'm quite proud of the organization. Dave McReynolds, dear friend, died not very long ago. They are sort of fiercely secular peace group, and they've done a lot of very good work over
I
the
mean,
years.
fiercely secular in the sense they're not Catholic. Yeah, I'm saying kind of, yeah. Maybe? No? All right, okay. Maybe that's another Barcrow Radio about the
Oh,
War Resisters
AJ
League.
Musty was one of the people who was a major person in the War Resisters League, and he and Dorothy Day got along sort of famously. David McReynolds was, of course, the person who made the civil defense drills that Dorothy organized in the 1950s. Dorothy created in the 1955 to 1961, but it was the fourth year that David came to town, became a member of the War Resisters League, and David was the one who brought suddenly from 12 people, 15 people coming to these monthly, or rather annual, yearly demonstrations. You suddenly had, when David came to town, 600 people came, 1,000 people came, and ultimately, I think it was 2,500 people came, and they shut off the civil defense drills. Civil defense in New York City, Dorothy Day went to jail for that for 30 days at one point for refusing to go underground. And what Dorothy and A.J. Musty had to say was that the civil defense drills were psychological warfare against the American people. The fact that you could survive a nuclear war. The city was not going to survive. What they said was basically that if you went into the subways to seek shelter from the nuclear bomb,
go.
that would be your grave.
That would be your grave.
That would
yeah.
be
That's right.
your
Well,
I
they
remember.
know where to find you.
I
Find the
remember-
bodies.
I remember being more. I've never been more terrified in my life than I was as a child, and with these civil defense drills, and told to get under my
Get under the friggin' desk.
the desk.
Yeah.
I mean, just that we had to practice getting under a desk
The
because
desk
a
would
bomb might
melt over your body.
drop on us at any time. That people were building shelters in their backyard. I was born in '55 too. I was terrified, and I've hated nuclear missiles ever since.
Yeah, and I grew up in Miami during the Cuban crisis, during the missile crisis.
Not the least of which because our country dropped it on Japan.
Yeah, right.
As a child myself, I was at a Catholic school. I was in third grade, And I was very close to Kennedy Airport, and planes would fly in over the school. And as they would fly in, they would open up for the landing gear to come down. And every time it opened up, my question was how can you tell the difference between a Soviet jet and a jet going into Kennedy Airport? And when it opened up, I was always waiting for the bomb.
Yeah.
So how did you come to this life? What brought you? I mean, it was your family business, I guess, in a way. Martha.
Business.
Not a business. Well, the business of helping people.
Yes. Yeah, I was born into it, but it took me a lifetime to really grow into it. I was out of the Catholic Church in my 20s and 30s and 40s.
What happened?
I don't know. The Catholic Church didn't do right by women and children, as far as I could tell, with my mother's experience.
Yeah.
So I spent, a lifetime working, paying my war taxes.
What work did you do?
Occupational therapist. I work with kids with learning differences and with the elderly. And
did you enjoy that work?
I loved it. It was a great profession, and just about every major decision that I've made in my life has been influenced by what my mother and grandmother would have to say about it. So I've been deeply influenced, but it took me forever to come to grips with what my baptism meant and what the work at the house really meant.
So have you come back to the church?
I had to do that before coming back to the Catholic Worker, actually.
Yeah. And Carmen, how did you become a Catholic worker follower or person?
I did so out of college. I had the chaplain at the school that I went to, Dennis Hawes at Grinnell College in Iowa, sent me to the Catholic Worker. He'd become. Why did he become close to me? Because he was such a good preacher. I used to go to Mass, but he was such a good preacher that I would go to listen to him every Sunday. He did wonders with the Scripture, and it was through him. He was at Grinnell during the war in Vietnam, and the question of my life, the reason that I think that I went to college, the great motive that I had for wanting to go to college, is because I wanted to figure out who was right and wrong in the war in Vietnam.
Wow.
And it was Dennis Hawes at Grinnell and the history professor there. Among the first things they said to me is, you got to understand, the students knew more than we did at that time. And Dennis Hawes had quite a remarkable history with the students there and was a radical himself. And I think in certain ways certainly knew who Daniel Berrigan was. But the main document that hit me, the answer, when the answer finally came, it was Martin Luther King's Beyond the Vietnam speech. And that should be a required reading for everyone in high school these days. Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech. And what he said in there that was so important to me at the time was that by 1954, the United States was paying for 80% of the French effort. The French effort was to recolonize Vietnam, so we had no better motive for being there. But then, of course, he said it would be seductively tempting to stop there. And he went beyond Vietnam, and he began to talk about Guatemala and El Salvador, and places in Mozambique, in Africa, in South Africa, in Asia, that the United States military had become exactly what John Kennedy called it. It was a Pax Americana, like the Pax Romana.
An industrial complex, according to Eisenhower.
Yeah, the military industrial, absolutely. And so it was from there that, because of both my faith, he became my academic advisor, Dennis Hawes, and he knew of the Des Moines Catholic Worker. And the Des Moines Catholic Worker was founded by Frank Cordero, who in 1976, immediately after the war in Vietnam, and it was born of the energy of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I'm very, very thankful for that, because I think of that as a high point in American history. The American people resisted the war. A significant portion of the American public resisted the war overtly.
It was a high point. I agree.
Yeah, but it was many years ago.
You have both been...
Where are we now? But we want to get to that. That's our last question.
Yeah, I was 14 when my brother, at the age of 20, was sent to Vietnam, and that was pretty radicalizing for all of us.
So, as part of what you do is your activism. You've both been incarcerated many times, and you're part of the Kings Bay Plowshare 7 and are under house arrest, facing the possibility of many years in federal prison for your actions.
And you're only allowed to go so far from your place of residence down in the Bowery. What are your restrictions? Because we took a picture of your ankle bracelets. I've got to say, Carmen's is a lot more impressive than Martha's.
The GPS doesn't work in the hills of Vermont.
So you can actually walk where you want to.
Yeah, right now.
So what are the restrictions that the court has put on you?
We're on curfew. We have to be in our houses from 8:30 p.m. to 7 a.m. And we have to get permission to travel anywhere outside of, for Carmen and I both, we're allowed to be in 2 locations, our family homes and the work at the Catholic Worker.
Then how come you can get to come to Gebhard's up on West 72nd Street?
Well, I think this is part of the district that we're
Okay,
restricted
so
to.
you're allowed to come up here.
We need to be home at 8:30.
Okay.
We need to be home for a curfew. The curfew is 8:30.
Right.
Yes, Mom and Dad will make sure you're home before the curfew's over. Yeah.
So I just want to share with you that as a young mother in 1987, I took a train just for a 3-day trip to Cape Canaveral to protest along with Dr. Spock, to protest the testing of the Trident missile. And as it turns out, my father, he's passed away since then, was a practicing Catholic, worked on that project.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how much my father and I differ. But about a year ago, you 2 and 5 others broke through a fence and walked onto the U.S. Trident submarine nuclear missile base in St. Mary's, Georgia. This is the largest storage area of nuclear war devices in the world. Why did you choose to do this action?
Well, I had been aware of the Plowshares movement since its inception in 1980 with the Berrigan brothers, and it's similar to how do I explain myself for coming back into the church and coming back into the Catholic Worker and finding myself participating. We did the daily readings. It was a very complex and uncomfortable discernment process for me. And some of us in the group have done Plowshares actions in the past. Carmen and I are the neophytes in the group. And the reason we chose the Trident missile site was because that is the most deadly weapons system that we have. It can strike anywhere on the planet within 15 minutes.
Whoa.
And recently they were doing some testing. May 9th down in Kings Bay, the birthdays of both Dan Berrigan and Peter Maurin. A Trident II D5 missile, unarmed, of course, was shot off. And I think since we've done the action, more and more obvious concern is coming to the forefront with Donald Trump threatening to use these weapons. We are now going to be spending $1.7 trillion to upgrade our weapons system. And the point is we want to make these weapons more usable. And so I felt I have also had a chance to travel to Korea.
What do you mean
and
potentially
Iran.
usable? Make it easier to use?
Easier to use in that supposedly we can control the amount of radiation release, the dial-up, dial-down mechanisms on these new weapons systems. And I could not participate in such an action after my years of study and awareness of this problem.
Wait, I don't understand. What do you mean? We want to make them easier to use. You mean
The
the United States? Okay.
the weapons dealers,
Which
and
makes them even
the
more
military.
dangerous.
To make them more usable and get away with it, supposedly to get away. These are first strike weapons, obviously.
Yeah. Carmen, go ahead. You wanted to say something.
What they don't want recognized that the weapons are rather clearly illegal by a very simple derivation of international law, if you care at all for international law. The federal courts care not at all for international law, or they are very careful about international law. They don't want it introduced at trial.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these, very reasonable, logical, existential arguments for going on this nuclear base, which I hear is very large, and we heard a bit about the whole story about how it would happen. But I mean, how do you make that decision as a person? It must be a very emotional.
As a community.
I mean, as an individual, how do you come to that and say, I've got to do this? What is that point where you go like, I'm going to do this?
Right. What are the teachings of Christ in the 21st century for us? How do we, if we want to call ourselves disciples of Christ, what does that mean in our own times and our own problems. And, you know, the two greatest existential threats are climate disruption and nuclear holocaust. People are now saying AI is also part of that problem. And if I'm going to talk the talk, how am I going to walk the walk? I mean, Dorothy handed me John Hershey's book, Hiroshima, when I was a kid, and that embedded itself in me. And this experience of, you know, returning to one's baptism has to be translated into action. Faith without works is empty.
Where are you now with the legal process? I mean, you're facing years ahead. Is it?
Do you have a trial date?
No trial date yet. I don't think they're anxious for us to have a trial because of this question of bringing the legality of the weapons to the federal court system. But we are waiting for a response from the trial judge. Hopefully a trial date will be set in the near future.
And you'll stay in touch with us as we move forward. We
Sure.
do get updates, so we
Yeah.
we
the
would
website.
we would love to keep up with your trials and tribulations and works that you're doing.
Dorothy Day talks about by little and by little. What does that mean?
One of her favorite saints was Therese of Lisieux, and she was the saint of the little way. Dorothy was accused of putting a Band-Aid on a cancer with trying to deal with the immediate needs of the poor, and we have to live our lives taking small steps and doing humble work and praying that the effects will be felt.
You know, I embedded myself with the Witness Against Torture in Washington, D.C. when they were protesting the Guantanamo incarcerations there. And one of the questions I kept asking is, what good does this all do? I mean, I would walk around with them. I'd walk with the hooded prisoners representing the Guantanamo prisoners, and I'd ask people along the way, do you know what's going on? And many times they said, no, I don't know. And I is kind of like I'm in the air. It's like
You're a
barcrawlradio. We're out there.
quasi-journalist.
It's part of our job is to kind of get the message out. How do you get that message out? Is that message going out? This is a very, as Dorothy Day says, this is a very complex thing you're doing. And I doubt many people really get it. Not that they couldn't, but they don't get it.
Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld are free and at large. Gina Haspel has gotten a raise. These are the people who were deeply behind our government's use of torture. The action in Yemen, Kathy Kelly came to town. You remember Kathy Kelly?
We had her on the show
right.
recently.
And Kathy Kelly had the Catholic Worker begin outside the UN and now in Union Square Park weekly. An update on what's going on in Yemen, on the war crimes that we are committing in Yemen. And it is within that context that I entered the process. And I didn't know who was going to be in the room when I entered the process for the Kings Bay Plowshares. And when I saw who was in the room, these people had already had prior felonies, in which case they are going to suffer, they're going to be sentenced more deeply than I am. I knew them all, and we had all been involved in many things together, including the trip to Guantanamo.
Guantanamo, right.
So, so I was in the position of often, in the same way that Martha was, that I could not do this with these people who were calling for it. Now, I don't know what change it's going to make. I don't know that we can stop climate change. I have no idea whether we can stop it. I don't know that we can stop the Trump administration from going ahead. Recently, it seems to me that we are giving the recipe for nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia. Astounding. And it calls for a revolt. And really, there have been revolts. There have been. We are watching the Extinction Rebellion take form. The women's movement in Washington, D.C., those demonstrations, we've never seen the likes of them before. So there's a lot of good stuff to go and build on. Mm-hmm. I was lucky enough to have, I offered Phil Berrigan, the last time he spoke publicly, I had brought him to the stage. It was about the war in Iraq. And when he left the stage, his last words to the American public were, "Don't get tired." And you'd mentioned the Eisenhower earlier in the military-industrial complex, but he says that there's a solution to that, and it's an informed and conscious people is his solution to it. That the people need to be informed, in which case they can raise the battle. And I can be sort of remarkably optimistic at certain times.
Martha, any last words?
Well, since doing this action, I feel an incredible sense of liberation and joy in the fact that I did say no to the nuclear arsenal. And we're simply called to do the best we can and to witness as best we can for the common good. And I'm happy with that. Can I just read you again?
Please,
The
go right
Catholic
ahead.
Worker is not discouraged if the world shows no signs of adopting its program as such. The canons of success of the world are not those of the Catholic Worker. The doctrine of personalism only demands that each individual preach what he believes to be right and do everything possible to realize it. When the individual has done this, his responsibility is satisfied, and it is society's responsibility to respond to the right that has been set forth. The important thing is that the individual remain true to his ideals, though the whole world go elsewhere.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Carmen. Becky and I have been talking with Carmen Trotta and Martha Hennessy, members of the Catholic Worker Movement and the Kings Bay Plowshare 7. As we speak, they await the court's decision on whether they will serve significant time in a federal prison. Martha and Carmen, we've been looking so forward to talking to you. We are honored that you have taken the time to come uptown to share your experiences and help us learn about your work for peace in our world and about Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin and the Catholic Worker Movement. Thank you so very much for joining us on barcrawlradio.
Thank you for having us. Can I get another beer?
Thank you.
Absolutely.
You
It's
bet.
on us.
And if you would like to donate to their work, we suggest that you write to the Catholic Worker, 36 East 1st Street, New York, New York, 10003. Phone number 212-777-9617. We will post this address on the BCR website, barcrawlradio.com.
And Becky and I are always interested in your comments on our programming and welcome your emails and questions and suggestions. Just contact us at barcrawlradio@gmail.com. And remember, the most interesting conversations happens in the neighborhood bar.
That's what we say anyway.
We're a joy to be with.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You guys are really fun to hear. Very nice. It's great. You guys are great. It's a nice. It's very good atmosphere.
It is a good
Yeah.
atmosphere. I mean, the fact that you heard the sounds around you, and the buses always come at that point of the show. They stop right there. And I know they're going to leave.
This is what Dorothy wrote in September of 1945 after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mr. Truman was jubilant. President Truman, true man. What a strange name, come to think of it. We refer to Jesus Christ as true God and true man. Truman is a true man of his time in that he was jubilant. He was not a son of God, brother of Christ, brother of the Japanese, jubilating as he did. He went from table to table on the cruiser which was bringing him home from the Big Three conference, telling the great news. Jubilant, the newspapers said. Jubilate Deo, we have killed 318,000 Japanese. That is, we hope we have killed them, the Associated Press on page 1, column 1 of the Herald Tribune says. The effect is hoped for, not known. It is to be hoped that they are vaporized, our Japanese brothers, scattered, men, women, and babies, to the four winds, over the seven seas. Perhaps we will breathe their dust into our nostrils, feel them in the fog of New York on our faces, feel them in the rain on the hills of Easton. Jubilate Deo, President Truman was jubilant. We have created destruction. We have created a new element called Pluto. Nature had nothing to do with it. Great Britain controls the supply of uranium ore in Canada and Rhodesia. We are making the bombs. This new great force will be used for good, the scientists assure us. And then they wiped out a city of 318,000. This was good. The president was jubilant. Yes, God is still in the picture. God is not mocked. Today, the day of this so great news, God made a madman dance and talk who had not spoken for 20 years. God sent a typhoon to damage the carrier Hornet. God permitted a fog to obscure vision, and a bomber crashed into the Empire State Building. God permits these things. We have to remember it. We are held in God's hands, all of us, and President Truman too, and these scientists who have created death, but will use it for good. He, God, holds our life and our happiness, our sanity and our health. Our lives are in His hands. He is our Creator. Everyone says, I wonder what the Pope thinks of it. How everyone turns to the Vatican for judgment, even though they do not seem to listen to the voice there. But our Lord Himself has already pronounced judgment on the atomic bomb. When James and John the Beloved, wished to call down fire from heaven on their enemies, Jesus said, You know not of what spirit you are. The Son of Man came not to destroy souls, but to save. He said also, What you do unto the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me.